Canada paid for it, Michigan owns half. That's the fact pattern that detonated Donald Trump's attempted bridge shakedown in under 24 hours. Because when Trump tried to turn the opening of the Gordie Howe International Bridge into a hostage situation, Mark Carney didn't respond with emotion. He responded with paperwork. 4 sentences, 4 verifiable facts, and suddenly Washington wasn't bullying Canada anymore. It was threatening Michigan's own artery, and that is the real story. Not a bridge, not a tweet, not a personality clash. This is about how this trade war is actually being run, who it quietly serves, and why the people who build real infrastructure will always beat the people who try to weaponize it on social media. Stay with me, because later in this video, I'm going to show you the hidden incentive almost nobody says out loud. There is a private economic interest that benefits every day the new public bridge stays delayed. I'm going to explain how that incentive shaped years of lobbying, legal fights, and narrative warfare. And then we're going to zoom out to the bigger consequence. This bridge episode is a preview of how the USMCA review in 2026 is going to be fought, through choke points, not arguments. Welcome back to the Dollar Watch. We track the hidden economy, the contracts, the cash flows, and the structural leverage that mainstream coverage either doesn't understand or refuses to explain. Let's start with what happened cleanly, without drama. Trump posted about the Gordie Howe International Bridge as if it were a foreign asset Canada built to pressure the United States. The framing implied Washington was being taken advantage of, that the U.S. had to approve or allow the bridge to open on terms Trump described as unfair. A border showdown, a dominance move, a classic strongman narrative. Then the next morning, Mark Carney picked up the phone and called Trump directly. And Carney's message wasn't a threat. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a press conference performance. It was a correction. Canada financed the construction. Michigan already has joint ownership. American steel and American workers helped build it. And Canada looks forward to opening it. That was it. No escalation, no counter-tariff tantrum, no how dare you. Just facts. Because facts are the enemy of leverage theater. And the reason those 4 sentences hit like a slap is simple. They exposed that Trump wasn't actually negotiating about a bridge. He was searching for a pressure point. The bridge was the weapon. The real target was Canada's behavior across the broader trade fight. Ontario's retaliation posture, Canada's protection of sensitive domestic sectors, and most dangerously for Washington's leverage model, Canada's open exploration of trade channels beyond the United States. If you want to understand why this bridge mattered, you have to understand what kind of corridor we're talking about. Detroit-Windsor is not a scenic border crossing. It's an industrial jugular. It sits at the heart of North American manufacturing, especially autos, where just-in-time isn't a management fad. It's the difference between a plant running and a plant idling. In modern manufacturing, time is inventory. Delay is cost. Uncertainty is a tax. Parts cross the border multiple times before a finished vehicle rolls off the line. Modules, castings, electronics, interior components, drivetrains. This is a continental assembly system. When border throughput slows, the pain doesn't stay at the border. It propagates into shifts, overtime budgets, shipping contracts, and ultimately, the sticker price you pay. That's why redundancy matters. If a single aging crossing becomes the choke point, one bridge, one disruption, one accident, one closure, you don't get inconvenience. You get systemic risk. You get production stoppages. You get missed delivery windows. You get shortages that ripple through dealerships and suppliers. The Gordie Howe project was designed to reduce that risk. Highway-to-highway connectivity, modern inspection capacity, and a second major crossing that isn't captive to one private toll operator's incentives. Now here's where the story turns from infrastructure into power. The ownership and financing terms are not secret. They've been public for years. The 2012 Canada-Michigan Crossing Agreement lays out the basic structure in plain language. Canada agreed to finance construction. Michigan does not write the check for the build. In exchange, Michigan receives joint ownership of the bridge structure and a long-term financial interest. revenue rights once costs are recovered through tolling and operations. However you feel about that politically, operationally, it means one thing. This is not a bridge the United States can pretend it has no stake in. Michigan's stake is baked into the deal. The permit history exists. The public endorsements exist. The economic logic exists. And when Trump tried to reframe it as a foreign-built asset Washington must grant permission to, the problem wasn't Canada. The problem was Michigan, because Michigan reads that as, "You're threatening our economy." And that's exactly what happened. Local leaders and stakeholders, including figures tied to the bridge's earlier political push, started correcting the record, not Canadian officials. Michigan voices, the people who would eat the consequences. And when a president's leverage narrative gets publicly corrected by domestic stakeholders, especially in a swing state industrial corridor, it stops looking like strength. It starts looking like confusion. Now, let's be precise here. This isn't about calling anyone corrupt without evidence. We don't do that. But we do talk about incentives, because incentives are what drive politics when rhetoric fails. And the incentive structure around this corridor is not complicated. For decades, the dominant commercial crossing between Detroit and Windsor has been the Ambassador Bridge, a privately controlled asset that historically carried a massive share of truck traffic. The nearby tunnel has restrictions that make it less suited for heavy commercial flow. So if you control the main truck crossing, you don't just own a bridge. You own a toll monopoly-like advantage on one of the continent's most valuable trade routes. That advantage generates enormous revenue over time, not by innovation, by position. Now, what happens when a modern, publicly backed bridge is built nearby with better freeway-to-freeway links and more capacity? Competition shows up, redundancy shows up, and monopoly-style advantage gets diluted. This is why the Gordie Howe project for years attracted intense controversy. Legal disputes, permitting fights, lobbying battles, narrative campaigns. Different stakeholders argued different points: cost, necessity, environmental impact, governance, border staffing, who controls what. But the underlying incentive remained simple. If you profit from being the main crossing, you don't want a second crossing that works better. And that's the major reveal I promised earlier. If the new bridge stays delayed, someone keeps collecting tolls in a less competitive environment. That doesn't automatically prove any one decision is corrupt, but it explains why certain pressures and narratives persist year after year, because money has patience. Now connect this to Trump's attempted hostage move. If you are a political operator looking for leverage points, what do you look for? You look for choke points. You look for single points of failure. You look for assets that require approvals and coordination to begin full operations. You look for something you can threaten without immediately triggering a global crisis. A major new bridge on the continent's most important trade corridor looks like a pressure point, and that's why Trump targeted it. Not because he suddenly became a bridge expert, because he saw an approval dependency and assumed he could squeeze it. The mistake was thinking that squeeze would land on Canada alone. It doesn't. It lands on Michigan manufacturing. It lands on Michigan logistics firms. It lands on Michigan border communities. It lands on auto suppliers whose margins are already fragile. It lands on American consumers when costs rise. And that's why the pushback mattered. Not partisan pushback, structural pushback. When the incentives for opening a bridge are economic, throughput, redundancy, resilience, you cannot permanently block it for political theater without triggering blowback from your own side of the border. This is where you should zoom out, because this bridge episode is a microcosm of the entire North American trade war dynamic. Tariffs, threats, pressure campaigns, they are always sold as hurting them. But in an integrated economy, the pain doesn't respect the border. It flows along supply chains like electricity along copper. It finds the weakest connection, and it burns whoever is connected. Now let's talk about the language being used, because language is part of the weapon. Trump's framing treated the bridge opening as a concession Washington could withhold. That's not just negotiation, that's coercion. Coercion works when the other side has no alternatives and you have no self-harm. But in shared infrastructure, self-harm is built in. You don't get to cut a shared artery without bleeding yourself. Carney understood this instantly, and you can tell by how he responded. He didn't treat it like an insult. He treated it like a spreadsheet error. This is why technocrats are dangerous opponents in trade wars. They don't get dragged into the emotional frame where you can outshout them. They collapse the argument down to the contract. They force you to confront the record, and the record is what Trump couldn't fight here, because the record includes Michigan's own stake. So after Carney's call, the White House tried to keep the pressure narrative alive, but the core claims had already been corrected in public. The deal structure is documented. The benefit to the U.S. side is obvious. The previous U.S. posture toward the project, treating it as important, exists in plain sight, which leads to the question Washington still hasn't answered cleanly. If the bridge was so unacceptable, why was it previously treated as vital? If the ownership terms were so unfair, why did the agreement proceed? If America was being denied compensation, why does Michigan have an ownership stake and long-term revenue interest? The bridge didn't change. The agreement didn't change. The economic logic didn't change. Only the politics changed. The politics of leverage. And that brings us to the darkest lesson of this episode, the one you should be thinking about if you care about North American stability. Leverage is not the same thing as control. Control is what you have when the other side cannot move. Leverage is what you think you have until the other side reveals they have documentation, allies, and alternative pathways. Canada revealed something else too. When pushed, it can shift from reactive retaliation to proactive diversification. That's what Carney represents. It's not anti-American, it's anti-dependency. And the moment Canada, Mexico, or any partner treats American market access as a variable rather than a guarantee, the U.S. loses something more valuable than a tariff concession. It loses trust. Now, you might ask, why does trust matter in trade? Because trade isn't just buying and selling. Trade is investment. It's factory placement. It's long-term contracts. It's logistics architecture. Trust is what makes businesses build around you. When trust breaks, companies start designing around the possibility that you will weaponize access again. That means redundancy. That means alternate routes. That means less reliance. And over time, that means less American leverage. That is the trade war paradox. The harder you squeeze, the more you incentivize escape. And escape is what erodes dominance quietly. Now let's connect the bridge episode to the bigger calendar that is looming over everything. The 2026 USMCA review. USMCA has a built-in review mechanism. It forces the parties into renegotiation dynamics. Deadlines create leverage games. And if you're a pressure-first administration, you try to establish maximum leverage before the review. That's what the tariffs were about. That's what the threats were about. And that's what the bridge post was about. A pattern. Find pressure points, inject uncertainty, and force concessions. But here's the problem with that approach. When you use pressure points in an integrated system, you don't just pressure governments, you pressure businesses. And businesses respond by re-engineering. You can win the negotiation and lose the system. You can extract concessions while your partners quietly build alternatives. And once alternatives exist, your next threat is weaker. This is why Carney's 4 sentences mattered. They weren't just a correction, they were a signal. We're not playing your emotional game. We're going to drag this back into administrative reality, contracts, ownership, mutual benefit. And if you try to weaponize shared infrastructure, you'll have to explain to your own stakeholders why you're injecting risk into your own throughput. Michigan's reaction made that unavoidable. Because Michigan, more than Washington, understands what border friction actually means. It means plants slow down. It means overtime spikes. It means parts shortages. It means layoffs. It means costs passed to consumers. That's why the most important pushback wasn't Canada's pride. It was Michigan's practicality. Now let's talk about why this corridor is uniquely sensitive, because it illustrates how modern economies break. The auto sector isn't built like a warehouse economy anymore. It's built like a synchronized machine. A supplier makes a component. It ships. It arrives just in time. The next plant integrates it. The final plant assembles the vehicle. Inventory is minimized to reduce costs. That's efficient. It's also fragile. When you introduce unpredictable border delays, tariffs, inspections, administrative retaliation, political threats, you disrupt synchronization. A few hours can matter. A day can be catastrophic. And the cost doesn't just show up on one balance sheet. It cascades. This is why the Gordie Howe Bridge was designed as resilience infrastructure. It's not just another crossing. It's a risk management asset for a continent. So when a president tries to use it as a hostage, the people who understand risk management will react like adults. Stop playing. Open the bridge. Don't sabotage your own redundancy. Now, here's what this episode tells us about how the trade war is really being run. It's not being run as a coherent industrial strategy. It's being run as a leverage campaign, where visible choke points become props. And leverage campaigns always create one ugly question: who benefits from the delay? In this case, there is at least one plausible beneficiary: the incumbent crossing that has historically enjoyed dominant truck traffic and toll revenue. Again, that doesn't automatically mean conspiracy, but it is the kind of incentive that attracts lobbying, legal maneuvering, and political pressure. It's the kind of incentive that turns infrastructure into a battlefield. And if you think that's just a Michigan-Canada issue, you're missing the bigger pattern. When you weaponize trade with allies, you create domestic winners and losers. Someone benefits from tariffs. Someone benefits from disruptions. Someone benefits from monopoly conditions staying in place longer. And the public pays through higher prices and slower growth. That's the hidden economy. The people screaming war on television are often not the people paying the bill. Now, where does this go from here? The bridge, structurally, will open because the incentives for opening it are bigger than the incentives for delaying it. Michigan's economy needs it. Canada's economy needs it. The manufacturing corridor needs it. The redundancy need is real. But the political damage from the episode doesn't disappear, because it reinforces the lesson Canada is already learning. American access can be threatened for leverage, even when the threat makes no operational sense. That lesson accelerates diversification. And diversification is the long-term loss of leverage. So the Gordie Howe episode isn't just a fun story about a president getting corrected. It's a warning about how fragile our continental system becomes when leaders start treating shared infrastructure as a bargaining chip. Because the moment you treat the bloodstream like a weapon, you're not just threatening the other side, you're threatening the patient. I'll leave you with one final thought, and I want you to sit with it because it's brutal and it's true. Power is not the ability to threaten. Power is the ability to make systems run. Canada financed a bridge. Michigan got joint ownership. American steel and American workers were part of it. Those are not nationalist talking points. Those are operational facts. Carney used facts because facts are durable. Facts survive court fights, elections, and news cycles. Trump tried to use a bridge as leverage. Carney used the contract. Michigan used the supply chain reality. And the whole threat collapsed because nobody can bully a system that's written down and co-owned. If this breakdown helped you see how trade wars really work, through choke points, incentives, and paperwork, hit like and subscribe. We're going to keep tracking the pressure points leading into the USMCA review, because the bridge episode is not an anomaly. It's a preview,